This is the word of the Lord. Reverend will now explain to us.
I will certainly do my best, Paul. I do want to focus on the power of our words this morning, and as we do that, I just want to acknowledge that so much of our communication is actually non-verbal most of the time, or at least it used to be. In close groups, we used to hug one another. Remember that? Remember when we used to hug one another? Or if you had business or business relationships or colleagues, you would shake their hands and touch them, maybe slap someone on the back. And socialising also involves all kinds of gestures with our bodies and leaning in and smiling and nodding and all those sorts of things. But we are in a new distance kind of experience at the moment, and being encouraged to maintain that distance from one another. And it's kind of interrupted some of our non-verbal communication, which I think might mean we're becoming even more reliant on our words as a primary way of connecting. So we're going to look at the power of our words today. This section of the story in Matthew's Gospel, starts with the question to various people, who do you say that I am? And it moves to some very deliberate and profound words of Jesus. It's an unexpected question from Jesus. Who do people say that I am? What are they saying about me? Because we don't get a sense from Jesus that he has an interest or a concern about what the gossip is around the traps about himself. He gets on and does stuff. He's always healing people and doing some teaching and preaching and confronting various assumptions and authorities and that kind of thing. He doesn't display signs of needing to be liked. He's not worried all the time, what do they think of me now, what do they think of me now, this kind of thing. However, he is interested to know what people are making of his presence. He wants to get an idea of what they're picking up, what bits are getting through to them, how are they putting it all together in their thinking. And the range of responses that are reported to him are quite fascinating. John the Baptist come back to life. Because you might remember John the Baptist was executed by Herod some chapters earlier, and here people are saying, well, he could be John the Baptist come back to life. Not the first thing I would have reached for. Others are saying, going further back, he's Elijah the prophet, because Elijah was taken up by God and the story says he didn't die, and there's a tradition that he would return before the Messiah. And then still others saying Jeremiah or one of the prophets. Clearly something unusual was going on, and this was no regular guy, as people would say. What people were saying shaped how they understood what Jesus was doing, how they would receive his actions and his words. At this stage, for them, Jesus is something of a fascination, a curiosity, someone to gossip about probably. But Jesus turns to his disciples and he says, what about you guys? Who do you think I am? And the disciples are a bit different, because where the crowds got parables, Jesus' disciples got parables and then the explanations to the parables. The 12 walked together with Jesus pretty much everywhere he went during his ministry. They ate together and talked together. They generally just hung out together. So Peter's response to this question, what about you? Who do you say that I am? It comes from a profound experience with Jesus. And Peter declares that Jesus is the Christ. The choice of the designator Christ is very specific. Peter could have allowed wriggle room like the others were. Well, we think you're someone pretty special on a caliber with these people or something like that. But Peter doesn't reach for a vague response. He has come to a point of clarity and conviction. You are the Christ. And this is very significant. Peter does not yet even realize just how significant it is, because in the Hebrew tradition, the Christ is the expression of God on earth, over and above the prophets or the various angels who are understood to be messengers of God, bringing words from God. The presence of Christ somehow is the very presence of God in our time and space. And as a result, Jesus the Christ becomes central to the meaning of everything. And if we look back over the past 2,000 years, the leaven of this one person's entry into the world's history has been transforming individuals, communities, nations, and cultures for all that time. And I well remember how things changed for me when I came to believe that Jesus is in fact the Christ. Until that time, I was pursuing the kind of life that most of my contemporaries were after, a good enough paying job in some kind of work that I was at least vaguely interested in. That was the broadly kind of accepted goal for non-tertiary trained late teen people like I was. And then I came to believe that Jesus is the Christ. New things came alive in me. I became profoundly aware that I didn't know very much about anything at all. And for the first time ever, I really wanted to study. I wanted to learn things. I wanted to be equipped. I also came to the conviction that living life just for my own comfort and convenience was no longer really satisfying me. It wasn't cutting it for me. I wanted to work out how I could best contribute to the world, how I could serve my community, how I could offer myself. The clarion call to follow Christ continues to challenge the assumptions of the world and the status quo of popular culture. It's changed everything. Now, when we think about words, of course, we can think that words in and of themselves are symbols. They are little things that hold meaning for us, and we pass them between us in a way to communicate what we intend to communicate. Sometimes we use more elaborate symbols, not just simple words, but ideas that are contained in symbols. And we see this here when Jesus refers to Peter as a pebble and something else as a rock. So Peter, he says to Peter, you are Petros, which means a small stone or a pebble. And then he declares that Jesus as the Christ, that is a solid rock. That's a Petra, which is like a foundation stone, a massive rock so large you could build a building on it. It's the same word that's used in a couple of chapters earlier in chapter 7 of Matthew when Jesus talks about the contrast between people who build on sand and people who build on rock, Petra. And so it's meant to be this idea of strong foundation stuff. And while different traditions have understood this in different ways, I think the most straightforward way is to understand that Jesus is referring to the fact that he is the Christ that is the foundation of the church. Knowing Jesus is the Christ is a solid foundation upon which to build. Build a church, build one's life, build a sense of what is ultimately meaningful. Peter, the pebble or the stone, is a key leader among the disciples, so he functions kind of like a chip off the old block, if you like. So he has a very important role as well. And then there's this symbol of the gates of Hades, a very interesting phrase. It indicates that Jesus will build his church on the fact that he is the Christ, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against that church. And it's interesting because there are no gates of Hades. You can't go somewhere in the world and find the gates of Hades. At this time in history, gates were the structures that kept people safe and enclosed. They were the part of the city you could enter into and come out from, and when there was a threat or an attack, they closed the gates and hoped that the marauding people who were attacking did not prevail against them. Hades is the place of the dead, and the gates that hold people captive to death will not prevail against this church, the resurrection power of Jesus as the Christ. When Jesus accepts a declaration that he is the Christ, another symbol if you like, the symbolic meaning of that title in the Jewish mind announces that this is the central person of all creation and all time and all history. This is the person every other person should take notice of. This person changes everything. His presence and actions change the meaning of everything. He's like an interpretive key for what's most important. Some of you might remember the 80s. It's a few years ago now. I was young. There was a fad at that time of computer-generated posters that were just a series of dots that appeared to be in kind of slightly repeating but very random patterns. They were called magic eye posters. You can Google it still and you can get a look at one of these things. And the way these posters worked were if you focused on the focal plane that was actually the poster, all you could see were the dots. But if you relaxed your eyes and they went out of focus, suddenly out of this random pattern of dots would jump this three-dimensional object. You could kind of move around and see different angles. It's quite bizarre experience, quite uncanny. Not everyone's able to do it, of course, but if you manage to look past the obvious and allow your eyes to drift into another focal plane, they detect meaning on another level, as it were. And I reckon discovering Jesus is the Christ is a bit like that kind of experience. Everything we think we know, based on what our culture tells us we should focus on, doesn't really make sense. We look at it in a particular way. But if we can change the way we look at everything, something new becomes apparent. It only becomes apparent when you give up looking the way you've been trained to look and focus on something different. Jesus is the key to a new way of focusing, so that even when we look at exactly the same stuff, we see new things there with a whole new dimension. And Jesus warns his disciples not to tell anyone about his identity as the Christ because he's yet to shift the pre-existing assumptions about what that symbol means. And he wants to change the content of it, and he knows they're not yet ready to know about that. And then there's this little bit about binding and loosing, a troubling little section because it appears to attribute incredible amounts of power to people, that we would have the power of heaven in the things that we bind and the things that we set free or loose. But I've come to read it a bit more like a warning to us. A warning that, in fact, people have always had this kind of power with one another. And whether we realize it or not, we do bind up people's lives and we can set people free. And knowing that alerts us to the responsibility and the power of our words. But of course, words have different power depending on who utters them in our life, as it were. I think about parents and children. When parents say things to children, particularly when they're very, very young, those words are just assumed to be true, and they can be powerful in a person's life when they're much older and know that those things may not necessarily be true, but the power of those words can still bind someone up or indeed set somebody free. I remember, again, years ago, I must be reminiscing on my youth, but when they used to have rules about truth in advertising, there were clever ways of getting around them, of course, and there was an ad for a toothbrush brand, and they showed somebody in a lab coat brushing their teeth, just the back of their head, they're brushing their teeth, and they say, "This is so-and-so, he is a dentist, we can't show you his face," and it's all very serious, but what toothbrush is he using? And he holds it up, and you see the brand, and that's pretty much the ad. And they say, so-and-so, the toothbrush the dentists use. And we're supposed to know, and we do know intuitively, that he's a dentist, he's the authority on teeth, He uses that toothbrush. I'm getting one of those toothbrushes. Absolutely. Now, Jesus is talking to Peter when he talks about this binding and loosing, although I think the you is more generic than that. But Peter would have had enormous power because he was one of the leaders of the disciples and he had very close proximity to Jesus. So things that he said, of course were going to be powerful. Of course they were going to have influence. Of course they were going to tell people how to live their lives in response to this gospel. He had authority in the church. These days we're more persuaded by the people we know more closely. Everything's become relativized because we know so much about everything we don't know really what is true anymore. There's a great book by Peter Pomerantsev called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. I really recommend it. He's a Russian English journalist talking about the way facts have become set aside, other alternate facts, as was once told to us. And because of that, we don't know what to believe anymore. And it means anything could be possible, and we kind of, So these days we're more persuaded by people we know who we trust, which is not a bad thing, of course. We consider ourselves to be reasonably rational characters most of the time, and we'd like to think that we listen to the arguments and we are persuaded by the merits of the details of the facts and etc., etc. But oftentimes there's stuff we can't possibly access or weigh up. And we kind of cut through that problem by going, I trust that person and they think that, so I'm going to go with that. And that's not a bad thing to do necessarily. We make up for not being able to crunch all the data ourselves by believing someone we have already discovered to be worthy of our trust. That's why children trust their parents, initially at least, until they grow up to a point where they start to see, hang on, my parents are not always right, and they start to reassess those things. I remember when I became a follower of Jesus initially, there were many streams of Christian thinking I could have gone down, or Christian practice, or whatever it might have been. I think I might have made quite a charismatic or a Pentecostal for a while, and I'm quite keen on some of the traditions and da-da-da, but I got converted in a conservative evangelical context. So for the first part of my Christian journey, whatever they said, that was the truth. And if anyone said anything that was different to that, they were misled. They just hadn't arrived at the level of truth that I had arrived at. And it wasn't until I studied the authorities of original texts in original languages and read through the history of different streams of Christian thought and where they came from and what influenced them and all that sort of stuff that I could move beyond merely trusting the church leaders that were closest to me at the time. I became equipped to make up my own mind about various things. And this is the power of truth, which is a greater power than positional power or title power because you are a dentist or whatever, or indeed relational power because you know someone or they're close to you, whatever it might be. This is the power and authority of words that are true. The power of words that are true appear to have gone out of vogue at the moment. It's not popular in culture to think about words that are true. We're not sure what truth is. We seem to be losing our skills at assessing what truth is. Many no longer even believe there is such a thing as truth. We're all kind of a bit like Pontius Pilate wandering around, what's truth, and washing our hands of the struggle of trying to work it out. But words that are true do not shift their meaning depending on who says them or who denies them. The Greek word for truth is aletheia. Its root meaning has a sense of that which cannot escape being noticed. I love that because it has this sense that even though we can hide truth for ourselves, eventually when we get tired of exerting the pressure that's involved in hiding something, it will come forth. Truth just emerges out and becomes apparent. It is the most powerful of all authorities because when we arrive at a conviction as a result of words of truth, we don't feel the same need to defend our position because, and I think I incorrectly attributed to C.S. Lewis this phrase, and then I misquoted it, so it was a complete balls up, really. But you remember a couple of weeks ago I said something about protecting Scripture. The actual quote is, defend the Bible, I would sooner defend a lion. Unchain it and it will defend itself. And that was Charles Spurgeon, apparently, who said that. And I would say the same is correct about the truth. We don't need to defend truth. It's powerful in and of itself. Unchain words of truth and they will speak for themselves. Preach them and they will touch the hearts of people. They have a power of their own and they will not be quieted. See, the revelation that Jesus is the Christ is the bedrock of seeing a reality in a whole new way. It is founded on words that are true. As we follow Christ and we build our lives on those words of truth, we also become speakers of truth in love, hopefully. To the extent that we operate in the truth, we operate with the keys of the kingdom. And it is, in fact, the case that the things we bind on earth will have been bound in heaven. And the things we loose on earth or set free on earth will have been set free in heaven. To the glory of our God. Amen.